Hello everyone to part 1 of 3.4 Inheritance with IB Biology. The essential idea of this subtopic is the inheritance of genes follow patterns. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the different ways that genes are inherited. In order to do that, you are going to have to learn quite a bit of vocabulary. I suggest that you use Quizlet to study this vocabulary for this subtopic. I'd also suggest that you pause on this part of the video so that you can review all of the statements and guidance so that you become familiar with these statements and with any of the associated vocabulary. If you don't know some of the vocabulary words, go ahead and look them up now before you begin. And then here are the applications and skills statements. You can also pause here and again read through, maybe do a little bit of research and look up some of the words that seem confusing as well. Okay, so this is your warm-up for this video. You're going to draw this diagram in your notebook and then label the diagram using this vocabulary. If you're not familiar with some of this vocabulary, possibly genotype, phenotype, okay, maybe offspring, look it up and then go ahead and try to label this. Pause your video now because I'm about to show the answer. So here would be the answer for that previous warm-up. Here you can see that you have the father over here on the left side, the mother over here on the right side. You can see that he has that should say genotype over there, genotype of big L, two capital letter L's. He has 46 chromosomes. The mother also has 46 chromosomes. And she has a phenotype over here. She is lactose intolerant. Okay, that becomes important. She also has this genotype of small l, small l. So she has what we call the recessive alleles for lactose intolerance. And in fact, lactose intolerance is carried, how do you think? Is it carried on recessive alleles or is it carried on dominant alleles? If you look at the father, he has two dominant alleles. What is his phenotype? His phenotype would actually be normal. He is lactose tolerant. The mother is lactose intolerant, and she has two of these recessive alleles. That does tell you that this is a recessive inheritance pattern for lactose intolerance because of those two recessive alleles that she has in her genotype. Okay, genotype, remember, is the combination of two or more alleles that make up a phenotype. Phenotype is the actual expression of the genotype. It's what actually shows up in the physical expression. I do like to stay away from saying physical expression because, for instance, with lactose intolerance, there's not really a physical expression. You can't actually see lactose intolerance per se. If you looked at it at the molecular level, you could see it, but just keep that in mind. Most of the time, sometimes people like to think of phenotype as only the physical features, but it's not always the physical features. Okay, here we have the father giving his alleles, right, one of each of his alleles to two different sperm that were produced, okay? And so one of the sperms has one of his big L alleles, the other sperm has the other big L alleles. These sperm each have 23 chromosomes, right? A haploid number. The parents have a diploid number of chromosomes. They went through meiosis, right? As you learned about in 3.3, and they produced these gametes, right? Sperm over here, and then the mother produced eggs because those are the female gametes. And each of those eggs contained one of her alleles from her genotype, one each of her recessive small l alleles. And each of them, each of her eggs is going to have 23 chromosomes because they're haploid. Remember, we want the haploid gametes, the egg and sperm, to combine to form children, the offspring, right? And they each also have their own genotypes now. And you can see that it's a combination of the mother, right, with the small l, and the father with the large L. So each offspring does have a big L, small l genotype. We can also call these genotypes heterozygous. Heterozygous genotypes. The parents each have homozygous genotypes. We can further differentiate homozygous genotypes by saying, for example, the father has homozygous dominant genotype. The mother has homozygous recessive genotypes. If this vocabulary is starting to confuse you, I would highly suggest going into Quizlet and finding the 3.4 vocabulary for IB Bio. You can literally type in 3.4 IB Bio and you should be able to find this vocabulary and just review it. There is a lot, as I said before. So we've got homozygous dominant genotype over here with the father, homozygous recessive genotype with the mother because she has two recessive alleles. The father has two dominant alleles. The children each have one dominant and one recessive. This gives them a heterozygous genotype. And heterozygous is not dominant or recessive, it's just heterozygous because it contains one dominant and one recessive allele. Something else that you're going to want to familiarize yourself with is Punnett squares. So before we begin with 3.4 and really getting into the statements, let's just practice a Punnett square. We will use a Punnett square using the alleles for lactose intolerance from the example that we just looked at. So how do we draw a Punnett square? It's just a square that is divided into 4 sections. This is what we call a monohybrid cross. Later, we'll be talking about dihybrid crosses, which deal with 2 different traits. But for now, we're going to stick with the lactose intolerance trait. So, lactose intolerance. What are the alleles? The alleles, what's the dominant allele? It is an uppercase L. And that allele codes for normal tolerance to lactose, right? What is lactose intolerance, by the way? Lactose intolerance is the inability to process lactose. You know from previous studies that lactose gets broken down into galactose and glucose by which enzyme? By lactase, right? So just remember that for a second. Maybe let's put that in another little box over here. Okay, we've got lactose gets broken down into galactose and glucose, right? Which enzyme does this? It is lactase. All right, so let's come back here. We've got a lowercase l. The lowercase l represents the allele for lactose intolerance, right? Okay, so let's go back to the Punnett square. I'm going to draw the mother's allele on the top of the Punnett square. We're going to draw that in red. And she had 2 lowercase alleles. The father we'll draw with blue. He had 2 uppercase alleles for normal tolerance to lactose. What Punnett squares represent is the percent likelihood that the offspring will have any one trait based off the parent's genotypes, right? So this is mother's genotype up here, This is father's genotype right here. So let's go ahead and complete the Punnett square. We're going to carry over the father's big L right here and there, and here and here. The mother's small l gets carried down like this. And we can see it does fit exactly with the example that we used before. And how would we draw this percent likelihood here that we've ended up with? You can draw it in two different ways. There's the genotypic ratio. It's important that you know how to do both of these. Genotypic ratio is right here, and the genotypic ratio is big L, small l, to big L, small l, to big L, small l, to big L, small l. Okay. This should actually just be a ratio of 1. It's not 1 to 1. Then we have the phenotypic ratios. Phenotypic ratio for this should actually just be a ratio of 1. It's not 1 to 1. This is not what it always ends up looking like. I will do an example in a second that shows us what it could look like in another scenario. As you can see, the big L actually is overpowering the small l. Remember that the big L, is the dominant trait. Okay, so this is the dominant trait and dominant allele. And then this one is the lowercase l, and it's always the lowercase letter that represents the recessive trait or recessive allele. Okay, and so you can see over here in the Punnett square, what is the percent likelihood that the offspring will have lactose intolerance? There's a 0% likelihood of lactose intolerance in this case. Okay, but there's a 100% likelihood that what? Likelihood of lactose tolerance, which they inherited from their father. And they all have heterozygous genotypes. Okay, 100% likelihood of heterozygous genotypes. So let's do another example where we are looking at if the parents had different genotypes. Okay, so let's say that the Punnett square looked like this instead. And let's say that both of the parents had heterozygous genotypes, meaning big L, small l, big L, small l. What would their offspring look like? We've got big L, small l over here. Got small l. We've got big L, small l right there. And so as you can see, the genotypic and phenotypic ratios would look very different here. So let's go ahead and draw those out as well. So here we have the genotypic ratio showing big L, homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and then homozygous recessive. And so that ratio ends up being 1 to 2 to 1. The phenotypic ratio, which is what the physical expression ends up being like, is tolerant offspring to intolerant offspring, which would be 3 to 1. The 3 comes from this homozygous dominant genotype, this heterozygous, and the one